Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Archaeology. In this video, we're going to discuss Archaic period Greece, as well as early Classical Greece, from about the 800s BCE to about the mid-400s BCE. First, we're going to discuss Greek colonies during this period. Then we're going to discuss the definition of Greek spiritual and religious beliefs, specifically the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses. We'll also discuss how Greek religious and spiritual beliefs impacted their death customs and burial rituals during this period. Then we'll discuss the Olympic Games and how this spiritual event brought the Greek people together. After that, we'll discuss Archaic and early Classical Greek material culture. We'll discuss Greek pottery and sculpture and architecture, and how these forms evolved over time. Then we'll discuss agriculture and life outside of the cities of Greece. We'll discuss labor and class in ancient Greece, and how changes to Greek society during the Archaic and early Classical periods gave rise to the emergence of Greek democracy in Athens. Finally, we'll finish our discussion by discussing the Greco-Persian Wars of the late Archaic and early Classical years. We'll discuss the structure of the Greek city-states militaries, specifically the Hoplite system. We'll talk about how the Hoplite system reflected the values of Greek culture during the Archaic and early Classical years. Then we'll discuss the course of the Greco-Persian Wars and the conclusion of this conflict, and how the end of this war set Greece up for its high and late Classical period, and eventually its Hellenistic period as well. These periods will be the subject of future videos. As you remember from our previous video, many Greeks fled the Greek mainland during the Dorian invasion and after. They set up colonies, settlements across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. In these colonies, these Greek refugees transmitted elements of their culture to the local people. This transmission and mixing of cultures was most evident in places like Sicily and Italy, called Magna Graecia by the Greeks of the time. In these settlements, the Greeks also learned from the indigenous peoples as well. This is particularly true of the settlements in places like Asia Minor and North Africa. The Greeks of the early Iron Age and Archaic period fled the chaos of mainland Greece. They traveled by sea, establishing new colonies across the Mediterranean, in places like North Africa, as well as further flung areas like what is now Spain, France, and Italy. They used ships like the one shown here to make these voyages. As I mentioned before, travel in the ancient world was much easier over water than it was over land. These colonies, some of which grew into true cities by Child's parameters, exported Greek culture across the Mediterranean. In these colonies, the Greeks also came into contact with other people groups, like the Iberians of what is now Spain, the Phoenicians of the Levantine coast in North Africa, and the Celts of what is now France, as well as the Etruscans and Latins of the Italian peninsula. These people would become the Romans. The Greeks brought their material culture with them. Here's an example: the Temple of Archaeology in Sicily, built around the 500s BCE. You'll notice that this temple was built according to the Doric order of architecture. We'll discuss more about the Doric order later in this video. To better understand ancient Greek spiritual and religious beliefs, we have to discuss the ancient Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses. The ancient Greeks had a pantheon of between 12 and 13 major gods. They also had many other smaller deities and demigods they worshipped as well. A few notable examples are Zeus, the king of the gods and the god of thunder and lightning, his wife Hera, the goddess of marriage and motherhood, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, Ares, the god of war, Pluto, also known as Hades, the god of death, Hephaestus, god of metalworking, Artemis, goddess of the hunt, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and sexuality. The Greek religion was based around the worship of the Olympian gods and goddesses. Some scholars argue that there were 12, others argue that there were 13 Olympians, depending on whether Dionysus, the god of wine, is considered to be a part of the Olympian pantheon. The Greek religion may have evolved from older Indo-European spiritualities, especially the god Zeus, shown here on the left side of this slide, who bears many similarities to Thor and Odin, sky gods of the Germanic peoples. Zeus is much more like Thor and Odin in the respect that he wields lightning bolts. He's very different from the Egyptian and Mesopotamian sky deities, Amun-Ra and Anu, whom we discussed in previous videos. There are, however, some influences from the ancient Near East and Egypt, particularly on the goddesses Athena, Aphrodite, and Artemis. This sculpture is believed to be of Athena, and you can see the similarities in the sculpture work on her face to the Inanna mask we viewed in a previous video. In spite of some of these similarities, there are some very significant differences between the Greek pantheon and the gods and goddesses of the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt. In the ancient Greek pantheon, there's less combination with animals, although there are some exceptions, like the minor god Pan, who was half human form and half caprine, goat form. The Greeks believed that their gods were far more civilized than those of the ancient Near East and of Egypt. If you read the myths the Greeks tell about their gods, though, their gods were really not very civilized at all, especially not Zeus, the king of the gods. Deities like Zeus had constant relations with human women, and many of these relationships were non-consensual. Some scholars argue that the ancient Greek pantheon, particularly elements like the sexual relationships that the male gods had with human females, may represent the patriarchal nature of Greek society. In spite of these stories and myths, though, women were allowed to become priestesses, which was one of the only ways that women could have power outside of the home in ancient Greek society. The gods lived atop Mount Olympus, highlighting the role that Greece's rugged geography played in the development of their civilization. The gods were a product of their environment, just as much as they were a product of the beliefs and desires of the ancient Greek people. The Archaic and early classical Greeks believed the Olympians were the offspring of an older set of deities known as the Titans. The Titans were much more elemental and pantheistic than the Olympians. The Titans included beings like Uranus, Father Sky, and Gaia, Mother Earth, as well as Cronus, Father Time. Some of the most important of the Titans were Cronus, mentioned before, and Atlas, shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. Cronus would eat his children to prevent them from conspiring against them, but he was defeated by Zeus. The triumph of the Olympians may have symbolized Greek spirituality's shift from an older pantheism to a more organized religion. The Greek myths held that after the Olympians defeated the Titans, they banished them to places like Tartarus, which was the ancient Greek religion's equivalent of hell. Or they forced the Titans to complete laborious tasks. Atlas, for example, had to hold up the earth. Archaic and early classical Greek burial customs and funerary rituals reflected the spiritual beliefs, but also the social beliefs of contemporary Greek people. The Greeks of these periods believed that the dead could not take many things with them into the afterlife. The tombs of this period were smaller. Most people were buried in cemeteries, like this one on the right, after a brief period of mourning, as shown in this image on the left. The Greeks did not mummify their dead. There's also less evidence of secondary burials, as was done in the Mycenaean period. Secondary burials, in archaeological terms, occur when a body is buried and allowed to decompose, and then its bones are placed in another tomb or catacomb alongside the bones of many other individuals. The Greeks of the Archaic and early classical period shifted away from this style of burial. We don't really know why. Perhaps the Greeks of this period developed more of a fear of the dead, or perhaps they just didn't want to go through the effort of having to pick through the bones of the deceased people. Ancient Greek spiritual beliefs had rituals to help guide the dead away from the physical world and towards the afterlife. But these rituals and guidelines were far less extensive than those of the Egyptians, discussed previously. At certain points in history, the Greeks would bury their dead with a coin in the mouth so that the spirit of the deceased could pay Charon, the boatman, to pilot them across the river Styx into the underworld, the realm of the dead. But the dead were not buried with other possessions, as other civilizations had done. The simpler burial rites of the Archaic and early classical period, compared to the Tholos tombs of the Mycenaean period, highlight the more egalitarian nature of Archaic Greek and early classical Greek society. The aristocracy was a lot weaker, and there were just a lot more middle class and everyday Greek people living their lives. Now we'll discuss the Greek underworld, also known as Hades. The spirits would cross the river Styx after paying Charon, the boatman, seen here at left. There are other rivers in the underworld as well, each with meanings of their own. Then the spirit of the dead would pass the three-headed dog Cerberus, who kept spirits from escaping Hades, seen here on the right. Sometimes humans of great power, like Heracles, also known as Hercules, would fight against Cerberus and chain him up so that they could go back and forth between the underworld and the physical world. The spirits would enter the underworld, and they'd be judged for their actions in life by Hades, god of the dead. Good people would go on to Elysium, which was like the ancient Greek version of heaven. The bad people would be punished in Tartarus, being tortured or forced to complete laborious tasks for eternity. Here's a piece of pottery that shows Sisyphus, who was trapped in Tartarus and forced to carry boulders for eternity. People trapped in Tartarus were also tortured as well, being dismembered by other animals, as among many other ways that they were tormented. Here's a simple map showing the layout of the underworld. Here's the river Styx. Here's Charon's ferry. Here's Cerberus in the gate. Here's the pavilion of judgment, where the souls of the dead would be judged. The good souls would go to the Isle of the Blessed, also known as Elysium. The bad souls would have to go into Tartarus and then would go on to eternal punishment. The ancient Greeks of the Archaic and early classical period believed that they could learn the will of the gods. by consulting oracles. The most famous of these oracles was the Pythia, priestess of Delphi, who supposedly received visions from Apollo, the god of wisdom. Some archaeologists think the Pythia may have experienced hallucinations from toxic gases that leaked to the surface in Delphi. Priests would interpret the Pythia's hallucinations, saying that they were visions given to her from their deities. A city was built around the oracle site as pilgrims and travelers visited the Pythia, hoping to learn the will of the gods, as attested by documentary sources from the period. Here is the foundation of part of the city of Delphi. As you can see, it's a very extensive settlement settled in the mountains of Greece. Here's a reconstruction of the foundation of the oracle building where the Pythia spent most of her time. These images on the right-hand side of the slide show her being exposed to toxic gases as the priests look on and interpret her visions. The ancient Greeks participated in the Olympic Games right around the year 776 BCE. The Olympic Games would be held in the town of Olympia every 4 years to honor the gods, specifically Zeus. Other gods would be honored as well. Greek men and boys from all the city-states and colonies were permitted to compete. The Olympic Games were an important cultural event as well, especially for Greek people spread across the Mediterranean basin. It might be the one time these people would come together in common cause to worship their gods and to compete in athletic competitions. Events in the Olympic Games included things like running, jumping, wrestling, horse and chariot racing, discus and javelin throwing as well. These games may also have been a form of military training, especially in events like chariot and horse racing, javelin throwing, and wrestling. Most events were completed in the nude. Women were barred from competing in the Olympic competitions and had separate athletic events. The Olympics continued until the year 393 of the Common Era, when they were banned by the Roman Empire under Theodosius I. Here are some contemporary Greek pottery illustrations showing Olympic competitions. On the left, you can see a young athlete preparing for the long jump. The jumpers would hold weights in their hands so they could jump further. On the right, we can see a wrestling match between two competitors. Biting and gouging of the eyes was illegal in these events. As you can see, the referee is about to strike the competitors for breaking these rules. And of course, all the athletes are competing nude. Here is a plan of the Olympic site at Olympia. Basically, it's the ancient Olympian village. As you can see from the color of the buildings, this site was inhabited continuously for centuries and was expanded over the years. Here we can see the archaic buildings are fairly simple, but more buildings are added during the classical and Hellenistic periods. Classical, of course, in orange, Hellenistic in yellow. Even some buildings are added during the Roman period as well. Here are some slides showing the evolution of the architecture at Olympia. Once again, highlighting the long-term use and occupation of this site. On the right, we can see a Doric column. On the left, we see a series of Ionic columns. Here are some artists' recreations of Olympic events. On the left, you can see the Hoplite race. The Hoplite race was one of the few events in which the athletes competed wearing some kind of clothing. In this case, armor it was an armored race, hence the term Hoplite race. Here we see another image of Greek wrestlers. Athletes, especially wrestlers, would rub their bodies with olive oil before competing. The olive oil was a skin protectant, protecting them from cuts and scratches. It also made cleaning dirt off of their bodies more easily after they'd competed. Here you also see the referee observing the fight to make sure both of the athletes play fair. Winners of Olympic events would receive a crown made from either laurel or olive leaves, as shown by this slide. They symbolically received this award, this crown, from Nike, the goddess of victory, shown here with the wings. Now we'll discuss Archaic and early classical Greek pottery. Early in the Archaic period, in about the 800s and 700s BCE, potters began moving away from the geometric styles of earlier periods, the so-called Dark Age / Early Iron Age. The styles of pottery in the Early Iron Age were very geometric. They did not feature human or animal figures, just designs. Archaic potters began to feature human and animal subjects on their ceramics, although these figures were very primitive and would evolve over time. Initially, there was a clear ancient Near Eastern influence, called the Orientalizing style by later scholars. Greek scholars would develop their own styles over time, coming up with the Black Corinth style around the 7th century BCE and the Red Athens style around 525 BCE. The ceramic seen on this slide is an early archaic design featuring primitive human subjects with geometric patterns as well. The first important pottery style that archaic Greek potters developed was the black figure style, developed around the 7th century BCE. Human animal figures are portrayed mostly in black. The backgrounds are lighter. Over time, the style of black figure pottery becomes more detailed as potters learned, or rather relearned, to make incisions, etchings in their pots to make their designs stand out. I say relearned because earlier Greek cultures did make incisions in their pottery, as we saw in a previous video. As the potters of this period became more skilled, they learned to represent action in their pottery, like Olympic contests, seen in this left-hand image, or battle scenes, seen here on the right. Here are some close-ups of black figure pottery. As you can see, the etchings and incisions allow the potters to make their figures more lifelike and to give them a sense of movement as well, as can be seen in both of these images. Over a century later, red figure pottery would emerge, around 525 BCE. The figures in red figure pottery are not actually red. They're more of a yellowish orange color. But the lighter color of the figures allows for much more detail. There's also more intricate incisions to represent shading as well. It makes these figures almost look 3D to the viewer. The potters of red figure pottery achieved this look through the use of paints, but also by mixing different types of clay, darker clay and lighter clay. Firing different types of clay can be difficult in order to keep the pots from cracking during the firing process, highlighting the increasing skill of Greek potters towards the end of the Archaic period. Red figure pottery is also much more likely to portray women as human subjects. This may be because the Archaic Greeks, just like the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, preferred to portray women with lighter colors rather than darker colors. Here are some additional examples of red figure pottery. As you can see, the level of detail on human and animal figures in red figure pottery is much higher, because the potter can use etching and incision in multiple different colors to really make these figures pop and look lifelike. As mentioned before, women are more likely to feature in red figure pottery. Now we'll discuss Archaic and early classical Greek sculpture. Archaic and early classical Greek sculpture evolved significantly over time. Early sculptures, especially the Pottery shown here, were fairly simple, very stiff, few poses, not very anatomically realistic. There's clear ancient, Near Eastern, and Egyptian influence in their styles. The eyes of these figures look very ancient Near Eastern, as you'll remember, and their bodies are reminiscent of Egyptian sculpture. Very stylized anatomically, stiff, very little motion, arms down at the side, hands clasped in fists, and 1 foot forward. Over time, Greek sculptors would learn to experiment. They'd make new sculptures that were more anatomically accurate, lifelike, and they would also develop new poses as well. One big difference, though, between Greek sculptures and that of the ancient Near East and Egypt is that the Greek sculptures were not afraid to portray their male subjects nude. Here are some examples of the evolution of Archaic and early classical Greek sculpture. These male Pottery figures, as I said before, show very little movement. 1 foot is put forward, but over time, the anatomical features become a bit more realistic and less stylized. The Near Eastern Egyptian influence is minimized as well, as the Greek sculptors develop their own unique techniques. Here are some more advanced Greek sculptures from the late Archaic and early Classical period. By now you can see the sculptures are much more anatomically realistic, much less stiff, and they just look a lot more lifelike. You'll also see that the hairstyles are more varied as well. Some of the sculptures feature male subjects with long hair, others feature subjects with shorter hair. Short hair on males became more popular later in the Archaic and during the Classical period. By the early Classical period, Greek sculptors were devising and using new poses for their subjects. These two sculptures on the left, one of which is made of stone, the other of which is made of metal, specifically bronze, show the god Zeus in two different poses. In one pose, he has a lightning bolt. The other pose, his lightning bolt has been lost. We also see there's much more detail to the anatomy and the muscles, much more realistic and lifelike, especially when compared with older sculptures of the Pottery style, like this one here. There's major differences, major evolution to be seen. Archaic and early classical sculptors depicted women in sculpture as well, although far less frequently. If these sculptors were portraying women, they were usually portraying goddesses. Early sculptures are very stiff, and the Egyptian and Near Eastern influence is very clear. You can see an image on the left. The woman's figure is very reminiscent of sculptures of Egyptian women, especially the arm at the side, the very narrow waist, the hair, and then the right arm placed over the chest. This was a common pose for women in ancient Egypt. We see it in sculpture. We even see it in female mummies as well. We also see an ancient Near Eastern influence in early sculptures of women in the Archaic period, such as this one here. The face bears many similarities to the Inanna mask, which we looked at in a previous video. Over time, the Archaic and early classical sculptors got better at sculpting women. Their sculptures became more anatomically realistic, their clothes became more complex and flowing, and they just look a lot more lifelike. Interestingly, sculptors in Archaic and early classical Greece did not portray women naked. You won't see statues of nude women until the Hellenistic period, the 300s BCE and later. We'll discuss the Hellenistic period in a later video. Now we can discuss Archaic and early classical architecture. The best examples of monumental architecture in the Archaic and early classical period are temples. Greek palaces and tombs during this period are less impressive, highlighting the decreased stratification and increased egalitarianism and democracy of the period. Comparatively egalitarian and comparatively democratic by the standards of ancient times, of course. There's three major styles or orders: the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. The Doric order was the oldest and was developed on the Greek mainland. And it's most popular from 750 to 480 BCE. The Ionic order was developed in Ionia, Asia Minor, and it's most popular from about the same period as well, but it spreads to the Greek mainland in the 500s BCE. The Corinthian order was developed in Corinth on the Greek mainland, and it's most popular during the late classical and Hellenistic period, from the 430s into the 300s. Multiple orders could be used in a single edifice/building. The best example of this is the Parthenon. We'll discuss the Parthenon in our next video. We're going to discuss some earlier examples in this video. Here are some diagrams of the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. These diagrams also contain architectural terminology for the features of these styles. I don't expect you all to know and memorize all of these terms, but I've included them here so that you all can familiarize yourself with them. I'll be using and referencing some of these terms later. In the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, columns are used to hold up the building's roof, also known as its entablature. The main part of the column is the shaft. The shaft is often decorated with fluting, seen here in this image. The top of the column is called the capital. The base of the column is called the base, or the pedestal. The entablature could be decorated with multiple architectural features, including triglyphs, metopes, and friezes, among others. We'll discuss some more of these architectural features later. Here are some specific features of the Doric and Ionic orders. Both Doric and Ionic columns feature fluting, these grooves on the column shaft, although their capitals are different. The capitals of Doric columns are much simpler. as you can see, comparing the capitals of these two types of columns. Interestingly, the Doric order decorates the frieze with triglyphs, while the Ionic order does not. Also, keep in mind that ancient Greek architects often mixed both orders together in the same building. Here's an example of a temple built according to the Doric order. It is the Temple of Paestum in Italy, also known as Magna Graecia. It was built between 550 and 450 BCE. Notice how thick the Doric columns are. Here is an example of some Doric columns at the Temple of Athena in Ionia from about 530 BCE. As I mentioned, Greek architects would mix styles. It's possible that Ionic styles were used in this temple as well, and that they've just been lost, with only the Doric columns surviving. Here's another example of a Doric temple. This is the Temple of Poseidon, god of the sea, in Greece, built between 444 and 440 BCE, the early classical period. As you can see, it's built primarily with the Doric order, but there are more carvings and more decoration on the column's capitals, suggesting a possible Ionic influence to this mostly Doric structure. Here's an example of an Ionic structure built at Miletus in Ionia during the 6th century BCE. Notice that the columns in the Ionic order are much thinner. We'll talk more about that later. Here is an Ionic temple built in Greece at Athens. It's the Temple of Nike. It's built near the Parthenon in the Acropolis complex, an area where both Doric and Ionic orders of architecture are used, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of the city of Athens, as they mixed different orders together. Another Ionic temple in Athens, once again highlighting how Athenian architects brought multiple architectural styles together to show the complexity and diversity of their city. Now we'll compare the Doric and Ionic orders alongside each other. The Doric order, as I mentioned, was much simpler, and it was most popular in the Greek mainland and in Greece's western colonies. The Ionic order was more common in Asia Minor and colonies in the eastern part of the Greek mainland, like Athens. Doric columns tend to be thicker with wider fluting, which scholars argue was meant to symbolize the masculinity of Doric architecture. Ionic columns are thinner, with more delicate fluting, more ornate design on the capital as well. This design is called volutes, and it's believed to have represented a woman's hair, symbolizing femininity. Ancient Near Eastern influence is more evident in the Ionic order, which makes sense because it was developed in Ionia, Asia Minor. These orders could be combined and used together, even in the same building complex, as seen with the Parthenon in the Acropolis. Now we'll discuss ancient Greek agriculture and society during the Archaic and early classical period. Land use patterns in Greece changed after the Bronze Age collapse and the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. Instead of a large population of destitute peasants working the land to support a king and an aristocracy, farmers in the Iron Age and then in the Archaic and early classical periods worked the land for themselves and sold their produce at urban markets. They didn't become rich, but they became well off enough to sustain themselves. Farmers would grow grains like wheat and barley, and they would raise olive trees for oil and to eat the olives. Some even kept vineyards to make wine, and some kept herds of sheep or goats to provide milk, textiles, and meat. They also would have kept oxen to pull their plows. Olive trees, probably the most valuable of all of the Greek farmers' agricultural produce, can live for centuries, but they mature very slowly. They take at least 4 years to fruit, and they're an alternate year bearing crop as well, meaning that one year they'll have a very large crop, the next year they'll have a small crop, and the year after that they'll have a large crop again. The loss of a wheat or a barley crop would have been difficult for ancient Greek farmers, but the loss of an olive tree could have been cataclysmic. Olive oil had many uses in Greek society. It was an essential ingredient in their cuisine, and it could be used to make medicines and cosmetics, like moisturizers, which athletes rubbed on themselves to protect their skin during athletic competitions. Here are some images of ancient Greek architecture. On the left, we see a vase depicting farmers harvesting olives. They would use sticks to knock the olives from the tree, and they would set a blanket on the ground to catch the fallen olives, which they would collect and then either eat or dry, or they would press into olive oil. On the right, we see farmers driving oxen in their fields. The oxen can be seen pulling plows. The farmers would then take their produce to the urban markets, where they would sell it and purchase other goods, like agricultural implements or livestock, which they would raise on their farms. The ancient Greeks also enjoyed wine as well. They raised vineyards, they pressed their grapes, and they fermented their grapes into wine, and they would store the wine in jars called amphora. Then they would export their wine all across the ancient Mediterranean, usually by ship. Shipwrecks often feature wine jars like these. In addition to new agricultural and land use patterns, the ancient Greeks of the Archaic and early classical period developed new senses of fashion. Compared to that of the Minoan and Mycenaean periods, the Greeks wore less revealing clothing during the Archaic and early classical times. The clothing covers up more, it's more loose-fitting, and it's less obviously sexualized. During this period, women initially wore tunics called the peplos, which were fastened with pins at the shoulders. Men wore tunics called chitons, which were closed with buttons. Over time, women began to wear chitons as well, but theirs were significantly longer. Both sexes also wore cloaks to keep warm. They would also wear their cloaks as head coverings, especially women. Men might wear wide-brimmed hats or helmets, depending on the actions they were completing. Women usually kept their hair long and wore it in a variety of hairstyles, both up and down. Men in the Archaic period typically wore their hair long, with beards, if they were able to grow one. Over time, shorter hair became more popular as the classical period went on. Women often wore jewelry, but earrings were not as popular as they were in other civilizations, being identified with slavery. For footwear, both sexes generally wore open-toed sandals. Here are some more images of ancient Greek clothing. Men wore the shorter chiton tunic, which would have allowed them to work in the fields or to move easily in combat, whereas women wore longer tunics, reflecting the gendered division of labor in their society. Perhaps the most important innovation of the Archaic and early classical period was the Greek democracy. Before the early 500s BCE, most Greek city-states were ruled by sovereigns called tyrants, or councils of kings and archons. Sparta was an example of a society that had kings, but also a ruling council called archons. Tyrant was not necessarily a dirty word in ancient Greece, the way it is to us today. Around 510 BCE, Athens expelled its tyrant. Led by Cleisthenes, shown here on the left, he began to create the first Greek democracy. The root word for democracy is from the Greek word demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. Cleisthenes built upon the reforms of previous Athenian statesmen, like Solon. In Athenian democracy, only adult male citizens could vote. Equal rights for all the citizens, but only free males over 20 years of age could be citizens. Women, slaves, and foreigners could not vote. In Athens, the electorate was divided into districts. The districts would vote for leaders, but it was a direct democracy, not a representative democracy, at least for the citizens. There were courts called dicasteria, and punishments were voted on by the electorate or assembly. One common punishment was exile, also known as ostracization. The assembly, called the ecclesia, would meet in the Athens market, called the agora, to make their votes. Democracy in Athens could not have developed without a large population of semi-independent farmers who fed both themselves and the city dwellers. The city dwellers, of course, oversaw manufacture. This is evidence of significant division of labor and resource surpluses in archaeological terms. Athenian democracy would continue to develop under the reforms of Ephialtes in 462 BCE and throughout the classical period. Other city-states would adopt egalitarian political reforms during the Archaic and early classical periods, but few would go as far as Athens did in their creation of democracy. Here is an archaeological excavation of the agora at Athens, as well as an artist's reproduction of what the agora may have looked like in Archaic and early classical times. The ecclesia met in the agora, and the courts met nearby as well. The ecclesia used pieces of pottery as ballots for their votes. They would use broken pieces of pottery, which the voters would write on, or for more important votes like ostracizations, they would use specially made clay tokens to prevent voting fraud. Now that we've discussed Archaic and early classical Greek society, we can discuss how the Greek military of these periods was a reflection of Greek society and values. The backbone of the Greek military during the Archaic and classical periods was the hoplite. They were named after their round shield called the hoplon. Hoplites were considered heavy infantry, equipped with full armor, shields, and swords and spears, and they would fight in close order in what was called the phalanx. Hoplites were generally not professional soldiers. They were citizen soldiers who had regular professions, especially in agriculture, and they would volunteer to fight. In some cases, they were conscripts in places like Athens, where the citizens, once again, free adult males, were expected to fight as part of their civic duty. There were some professional soldiers and professional military classes, though. Sparta had professional military classes, Men trained to fight from the age of 7. Some Greeks fought as mercenaries as well. The hoplites fought in tight formations, which would have required high levels of discipline. The hoplites would be supported by cavalry and unarmored light infantry called peltasts. Peltasts were armed with ranged weapons like javelins, slings, and archers were used as well, but to a lesser degree. The Greeks preferred melee combat. As mentioned before, hoplites tended to come from agricultural communities. They were usually of middling status. They had to be in order to pay for their armor and weapons. Poor men who wanted to serve in the military might do so as peltasts, light infantry. Rich men were more likely to serve in the cavalry because they would have to be able to pay for their own horses. The Greek city-states frequently fought each other during the Archaic and early classical periods, but they came together in leagues to fight external threats like the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. As you can see, the hoplite system reflected the comparatively egalitarian nature of the Greek society during the Archaic and early classical period. Here are some images that illustrate hoplite tactics, moving slowly and decisively in the tight phalanx formation, with spears out and swords at the ready. You can see their heavy armor, their shields called hoplons, their helmets, and even their greaves to guard their legs. Here are some modern reenactors reenacting a phalanx. Sometimes the hoplites would decorate their shields with personal designs. In other cities like Sparta, the hoplites did not decorate their shields, but instead had the symbol of the city, the letter lambda, on their shields. Here are some images of ancient Greek helmets, which changed significantly during the Archaic and early classical periods. The Corinthian helmet, shown here on the left, was most popular during the Archaic period. It provides great protection, but it obscures the wearer's vision, hearing, and vocalization. Later helmets, like the Illyrian helmet, shown here, offered less protection, but better use of the senses. And the Pylos helmet, center, offered even less protection, but it was much cheaper to manufacture than earlier helmets. Here are some more views of the hoplite armor. The armor was usually made of bronze, although sometimes iron was used. Swords and spears, however, were made of iron by this point. Here's an example of a Spartan warrior. Once again, we see that he does not have a customized personal shield. He has the symbol lambda for Sparta on his shield. Interestingly, this soldier is not wearing bronze or iron for his breastplate or cuirass. He's wearing one made of linen, which is much cheaper, but far less protective. Here are some images of peltasts. They wear much less armor, if any. They use javelins and slingshots, and their goal was to harass the hoplites into breaking formation. Here are some images of ancient Greek cavalry, known as the hippias. They generally had a more secondary role in ancient Greek tactics. They were armed with javelins or long spears, basically lances, and they would attack hoplites that had been separated from their phalanxes, as shown on this relief here. The ancient Greek city-states, especially Athens, had navies to protect their trade and to protect their ports. The preferred Greek military vessel, the battleship of the day, was the trireme, a light, fast ship with 3 levels of rowers. Contrary to popular opinion, the rowers on these ships were not slaves chained to the vessel doomed to drown if it sank. They were free men who were paid a wage to row in the galleys. Usually these were poorer men who could not afford their own weapons and armor to fight as hoplites. With this background about the archaic and early classical Greek military out of the way, now we can discuss the Greco-Persian Wars. The Greco-Persian Wars were a series of intermittent conflicts fought between the Greek city-states and the Achaemenid Empire from about 499 to 449 BCE. Although the conflict began a little bit before 499, but I'll talk about that in a moment. The Greco-Persian Wars are best documented by the Greek historian Herodotus. Later historians like Thucydides wrote about them as well. As you can imagine, Herodotus being Greek, his perspective on the war is very pro the Greek city-states and very anti the Achaemenid Empire. The main reason for going to war, the casus belli, was the expansive Achaemenid Empire had taken over Greek colonies in Ionia, Asia Minor. The Greek colonists of Ionia resented being in the Persian Empire, and the Greek city-states supported their revolts. In response to the Greek city-states' support of the Ionian revolts, the Achaemenid Empire, specifically under King Darius, decided it would go to the seat of the problem and invade the Greek mainland. The invasions began about 492 BCE. Both sides fought primarily with infantry, but the Achaemenids preferred large armies of light infantry, the immortals, that we discussed in the previous video. The Greeks preferred smaller forces of heavily armed hoplites. Both civilizations, the Achaemenids and the Greeks, had developed grand strategies that fit with their civilization's strengths. The Achaemenid Empire, as you remember, was very large and populous and diverse. So they built these large multi-ethnic armies in the form of the immortals. The Greeks were a collection of small city-states with a smaller population, but they had a reasonably large middle class that could afford significant amounts of weapons and armor. Basically, the Greeks preferred quality over quantity when it came to armies. Here's a map showing some of the most important battles fought in Greece during the Greco-Persian War. You can see the Battle of Marathon, fought in 490 BCE, followed by the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC and the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, after which the Battle of Plataea was fought in 479 BCE, and the major battles fought in the Greek mainland during the Greco-Persian War came to an end. We'll discuss these battles now. The Battle of Marathon was fought in September of 490 BCE, shortly outside of Athens. I'll let you guess how far Marathon was from Athens. The Greek forces, from Athens primarily, were heavily outnumbered by the Persian Achaemenid forces. Some scholars estimate that the Persians may have had as many as 110,000 troops, whereas the Greeks may have only had 10,000. Some scholars argue that the majority of the Persian forces were rowers taken from their ships who were only lightly armed. Either way, the Persians significantly outnumbered the Greeks. But the Greeks developed a strategy and used tactics that played to their strengths. They built a series of abatis, sharpened sticks driven into the ground, along the flanks of their forces, forcing the much larger Persian army to come straight at them. There were also marshes and hills on either side of the Greek army, funneling the Persian forces into a much larger, much smaller area. In military history terms, this is called a force multiplier for the Greeks. It allows a smaller force to face a much larger one in pieces. In the end, the battle was a massive success for the Greeks. They routed the Persians, even though they had sent out for help from Sparta. The runners, the Athenians, dispatched to Sparta, had to run a lot further than 26 miles, the distance from Marathon to Athens. They had to run over 150 miles to reach Sparta. One of the runners, Phidippides, made it from the battlefield all the way to Sparta, carrying the message calling for reinforcements, only to promptly die from the exertion. Now we'll discuss the Battle of Thermopylae, probably the most famous of the battles of the Greco-Persian War. It's been portrayed in numerous forms of media, including films, some of which are much more accurate than others. This slide shows images from the film 300, which came out in 2006. At the Battle of Thermopylae, fought in the summer of 480 BCE, between 70,000 and 300,000 Persians faced about 7,000 Greeks. The Greeks were led by King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 troops. The Greeks, heavily outnumbered, held their own against the Persians in the beginning, until the Persians discovered a mountain pass around the Greek position. The historian Herodotus describes how the Greeks were portrayed, leading to the Persians finding this mountain pass. The Persians then were able to surround the Greek force and destroy it. The battle was a massive victory for the Persians, but the sacrifice of the Greek soldiers, particularly the 300 Spartans, galvanized the disunited Greek city-states together to resist the Persians. After the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians continued towards Athens, where they burned the city, but this act only further intensified Greek resistance. Here are some images of the pass at Thermopylae. You can see how steep the mountains are, how difficult it would have been for the Persians to pass by the Greeks without knowing the secret paths of the mountains. Here are some images of the Battle of Thermopylae. On the left is a relief of a Persian soldier, believed to be from India, actually. Here are some spear and arrow points found at the battle site. Here's an image of the Battle of Thermopylae. The mountain passes would have forced all the Persian immortals together, negating their large numbers, acting as a major force multiplier for the Greeks. But once the Persians found the mountain passes, they were able to surround the Greek position and destroy the much smaller Greek force. Here are some human remains found near the site. These remains attest to there being a battle in the region, as these bones often show signs of combat wounds. After the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians destroyed the city of Athens, which only served to galvanize the Greek city-states against the Persians. In the wake of the destruction of Athens, the Greek navy fought a Persian armada at Salamis on the 26th to the 27th of September, 480 BCE. The Greek navy was outnumbered 4-1, but it won a major victory thanks to its faster trireme ships. Their strategy was also better. They forced the much larger Persian fleet to face them in a small bay, negating the Persian fleet's much larger size. Keep in mind that many of the Persian vessels were actually Ionian Greek vessels that had been pressed into service in the Persian armed forces. The Greek vessels, though, were faster, and they rammed the Persian ships and sank many of them, ultimately routing the remaining Persian ships. Here are some examples of underwater archaeology from around the Salamis battle site. Here's the remains of a ram, and in recent years, scholars think that the Greeks may have had a naval base from which they commanded their ships. This might be the foundation of that base. If you think that regular archaeology on land is difficult, underwater archaeology is even more challenging, not to mention it's a lot more dangerous as well. The Greek naval victory at Salamis greatly weakened the Persian military's invasion of Greece. It led to the Battle of Plataea in August of 479 BCE. And the Battle of Plataea fought to the south in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. 80,000 Greeks defeated between 70 and 120,000 Persians. In this battle, both sides were a lot closer in size. The Persians, under General Mardonius, were overconfident. They charged the Greek position, only to be pushed back after General Mardonius was killed. The Persians had some Greek subjects and allies fighting on their side, but these Greek conscripts fought poorly, probably due to low morale. They probably didn't want to fight with the Persians against other Greeks, especially after what happened at Thermopylae in Athens. In the end, the Greeks were victorious at the Battle of Plataea, and their victory there brought an end to the major Persian invasions of the Greek mainland. After the battle, the Greeks would go on the offensive and retake their colonies in Ionia until about 449 BCE, when the Greeks made peace with the Achaemenid Empire, emerging from their conflict with Persia victorious. The Greco-Persian Wars were a very significant event in both Greek and Achaemenid history. The war weakened the Achaemenid Empire, setting the stage for its defeat by Alexander the Great in the 330s BCE. At the same time, it strengthened the Greek city-states, specifically Athens and Sparta. The war strengthened and galvanized Greek identity and culture, prompting the cultural achievements of the late classical period. It brought the city-states together, but only temporarily. Former allies, Sparta and Athens, would go to war against each other in the Peloponnesian War of 431 through 404 BCE. This conflict weakened the Greek city-states and set the stage for the Macedonian takeover of Greece in 338 BCE, leading to the Hellenistic Age. Conclusion. Greek culture developed significantly during the Archaic and early classical period. Pottery, sculpture, and architecture advanced significantly and became more sophisticated. Initially, the Greeks borrowed from other cultures, but they soon became innovators in all of these fields. Greek society was more egalitarian and democratic during the Archaic and early classical period, once again, by the standards of the ancient world. The Greek social arrangement in this period, small farms, an agricultural middle class, inspired the Hoplite system, which allowed the greatly outnumbered Greek city-states to defeat the much larger Achaemenid Empire. Additionally, this agricultural system facilitated the rise of Greek democracy as well. We'll discuss Greek democracy and Greek culture further in our next video.